Hi everyone, welcome to chapter 4. I hope that at this point in time you are in awe of the amazing science of nutrition and you feel like your knowledge is progressing and that you are far more well educated than the average person you encounter in a day. So I'm hoping to continue that trend. The previous chapter on carbohydrates was certainly a challenging topic. I will say the same for fats, which is the current chapter. And I think that you will find the following chapter on protein to be a little less challenging, though equally insightful. So once we've gotten through the three macronutrients, I think you're going to find that you're very much on solid ground if you have a strong understanding of those things, and that it will be downhill from there. So hang in there. The tough stuff's all at the start, and then we begin to coast downward after that. So again, let me just reiterate that we established at the beginning of the course and the textbook that there are 6 classes of nutrients, 3 of which are the larger nutrients because in addition to their other roles, they are also calorie containing: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. You should at this point know off the top of your head that carbohydrates and protein both contain 4 calories per gram, and that fat contains over twice as much, 9 calories per gram. You should also know that the remaining 3 classes of nutrients which we have yet to cover are water, as well as vitamins, and then yet another category called minerals. So we're plugging right along. So looking at the concept of fats and oils, let's begin by talking briefly about the fact that we live in a world where there's a great deal of confusion surrounding nutrition. I'm sure you're starting to really realize that if you hadn't before you came here. And so there are other people who are phobic about fat, going, oh, fat is bad, you need low fat, you need fat-free, avoid fat. And others are going, no, all fats are good. I heard that fat is not bad, that's outdated, you can eat all the fat you want, fat's good. Well, unfortunately, like so many things in life, everything has shades of gray and it's not quite so black and white. So everything in moderation really is a fabulous mantra in terms of nutrition because we need a lot of things and we can tolerate a surprising amount of things even if we don't need them. But there are limits. So we have to appreciate what we need and how much is enough in order to appreciate how much is too much and what we may want to avoid or limit. So when you understand the science, you can make much more sense of that. So let's begin by looking at the functions of fat because there are a lot of positives. You know, nature created this bounty, these whole foods, all of nature's creations, everything from plants, including nuts and seeds and berries and grains and vegetables, to animal foods that we partake of, including dairy and eggs and meat. And all foods have a mixture of chemicals called nutrients, as you know, usually all 6 classes to some degree. That means that most foods, if not all, contain fat. Well, why is that? Why did nature make sure that almost everything contained carbohydrate, that almost everything contains fat, and as you'll learn next week, that everything contains protein? And why do all of our foods contain water, vitamins, and minerals in combination with the others? Why is simple. Because we need these things. Fat, for one, is a source of energy, right? 9 calories per gram. That's twice as many calories as we get from carbohydrate or protein because throughout all of mankind's history, our lives required us to be very physically active. That's only changed in the past 100 to 150 years when we began building all sorts of things and engineering movement out of our lives. So calorie needs have been high throughout all of mankind's history, and nature said, let me make sure everything has what you need. We also need certain vitamins to come from our food, and we're going to get into vitamins in a later chapter, but there's vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K. And while we get vitamins in many different ways, and our body even makes some of these vitamins for us, we need to get some from food. Well, Some vitamins are soluble in fat. That means they dissolve in fat. So any food that contains fat has those vitamins dissolved in it, A, D, E, and K. If we have fat in our body, in our blood, and in our tissues, muscle tissue, fat tissue, organ tissue, then we can absorb and hold on to the fat that we need to use inside of us. So that means that if we have fat inside of us, then we have fat soluble vitamins dissolved in that fat inside of us. So everything works in concert. This is why when we mistakenly fall prey to dieting hype that says this is bad or this will hurt you or don't ever eat this, it's like we're taking pieces away from a big puzzle. You don't want all your pieces on one side of a puzzle. You want them distributed evenly throughout. So you want to think of eating like that. It's a little bit of everything. There's room and there's a place for everything, but it comes down to balance. So when we store fat on our body, thank goodness we have it because it's a life-saving mechanism. If you're in a plane crash and you're stranded on the side of a mountain and there's no food, your body's going to eat itself and save you. If you become ill or injured and you are in the hospital or in some terrible state of health for a prolonged period where you're not able to take in enough food or you're not able to absorb your nutrients well, thank goodness for the fat on your body because you're going to last a lot longer than the person who was walking around with very little body fat. So body fat is protective. There's such thing as too much, which is harmful to our health, and there's definitely such thing as too little, which is harmful to our health. Again, it's about balance. Your skin, when it becomes dry and flaky, could be because there's not enough fat in your diet. Most of us assume it's water, but there are other reasons as well because fat plays a role in healthy skin. In that it helps to promote normal cell growth of all of the trillions of cells in our body. So every muscle, skeletal muscle on your arms and legs, as well as every other muscle like your heart, has fat in it. Fat is essential to the functioning of all your tissues, and your tissues are made of cells. So every inch of you is nothing but trillions of cells, and the membrane of every cell is made out of fat. So if we don't have enough fat coming in, how will we make new cells? And if we can't make new cells, then as the existing ones die, our tissues will break down, our heart, our liver, our skin, and so on. Additionally, it acts like a cushion and it helps insulate us. So you want a little fat on that body because there could be impact if there's a fall or a jump or something. You don't want things banging around into each other, right? And you don't want to be freezing to death. So it's a temperature regulating mechanism. When we have fat in our food, it creates a satiating effect. Hopefully you remember that word from before. So satiety refers to our sense of fullness. In other words, the absence of physical hunger. It keeps our stomach working longer so that the food doesn't leave our stomach as quickly so that we don't feel hungry as soon. So when we don't have fat in our meals, we can count on feeling hungrier sooner. And Lord knows it's important in that it provides flavor. If you've ever tried anything that didn't have fat, whether you were buying some sort of fat-free novelty or you were trying to cook more healthfully and omit fat, you know that it is not as tasty because that is one of the principal physiological and biological functions of fat is to appeal to our taste buds so that we will be driven to consume food to meet the needs of our human body. Again, you are really just trapped in the body of a caveman because your body was designed to get you to eat when food was encountered, since there were inevitable periods of scarcity throughout all of history. The problem of eating too much is a relatively new one. Throughout most of history, the only people that ate too much were the really wealthy people, and that's how you knew that somebody was really wealthy, is because they could afford to have so much food that they ate too much. So that was a rarity. So again, hopefully you understood early on that we need all 6 classes of nutrients and that each person's needs are somewhat variable. Water, vitamins, and minerals, we pretty much need the same amounts. Now, children need a lesser amount or a greater amount of certain ones than adults because they're developing. But at a given age in life, our needs are all very similar, regardless of what we weigh in terms of water, vitamins, and minerals. Where we differ are the three macronutrients, since they are the calorie containing nutrients. So if we calculated how many calories an individual needs, then some portion of those total calories that his or her body uses to sustain itself in a day needs to be derived from carbohydrate, some portion from fat, and some portion from protein. You learn that the majority, 45 to 65%, need to be derived from carbohydrate because it ultimately breaks down into sugars, which become glucose in our blood, the primary and preferred fuel for our trillions of cells. Second to that is fat. And so 20 to 35% of our daily calories. So those ranges, remember, exist because we're not all the same people. Different people have different needs depending upon their age, their body size, their activity level, their health status, and so on. So looking at the 20% in, this is going to be the average person who may or may not get some degree of activity in his or her life, but certainly is no avid exerciser. So most people, unfortunately. At the high end of the range, 35 is your true athlete. And I always say, if you have to stop and ask, am I an athlete? The answer is no, because you wouldn't have to think twice if you are. Most of us can think of somebody right now at the top of our head that's a professional athlete. And unless we are physically active at that level, we're not athletes. We may be avid exercisers, but that doesn't put us at the high end. So most of us are going to fall either somewhere from 20 to 25, maybe 30%. At that higher end are also going to be your people who have been injured, broken bones, or who have serious illnesses like AIDS or cancer, or have been burned, and have bodies that are in a excited healing state, trying to produce more cells very rapidly. So most of us, again, aren't going to be at the high end of the range. We're going to be closer to the lower end of the range. So again, the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges, AMDRs, were introduced to you in Chapter 2 of your textbook. You learned that there are nutrient recommendations for all people based on stage of life and circumstances, and that macronutrients have acceptable ranges specified here. We've already covered the bottom one. Now we're covering the middle one, the fat. So of the total amount of fat that you need in a day, which consists of several different kinds of fat, only a small portion of it should be in the form known as saturated fat. And you're going to begin to understand that more clearly. So when you look at the picture and you see 10% saturated, they're telling you that of your 20, 25, 30, or 35% a day allotment for fat, no more than 10% of that should be from saturated fat. And that is a particular form that when consumed in excess proves harmful. Hence, you know what that means. There's a tolerable upper limit, a TUL. What we want are these healthy fats in abundance, and we abbreviate them MUFA, PUFA, MUFAs, and PUFAs. Why do I say all this now when you don't know what it means? Because now you've heard it, and now as we go through it, you'll begin to more readily connect the dots. At this point, if you haven't taken any kind of notes, I would suggest you jot down a few things, because the idea here is that you're going to listen to this, and then when you go back and read the book, what you see there is going to make a lot more sense, and you're also going to have a more comprehensive understanding of it from the additional information provided within this lecture. So again, let's say that I, as a registered dietitian nutritionist, were to calculate how many calories you need per day. It all depends on how tall you are. It all depends on how much you weigh, how active you are, if you have any health conditions, and so on. Let's say that I estimated that you need about 2,000 calories a day. Well, at the low end, maybe you only need about 20% of your calories from fat because you are an average person who goes to work every day, certainly doesn't just sit still 24/7, but, doesn't get a lot of physical activity or maybe exercises a couple of times a week. At the high end, you are somebody with a severe illness or injury or a professional athlete, right? So I would say 2,000 calories times 20% for the low end, or 2,000 calories times 35% for the high end. And that gives me either 400 or 700 calories. So 400 calories represent 20% of a person's calorie needs if he or she needs 2,000 calories. You know there are how many calories in a gram of fat? 9. So if I divide 400 by 9, and if I divide 700 by 9, then I respectively get 44 or 78. So a person at the low end of the range, his or her needs would be around 40 to 45 grams of fat a day. A person at the high end would be around 75 to 80 grams a day. Very, very easy to get that much fat because fat is in everything, and like carbohydrate, some things it has more, some things have less. But it is more likely that we will exceed our fat requirements than not get enough in most days. So what happens if we exceed our needs? What happens with that excess fat? Well, remember, anytime we take in more calories than we need from anything that contains calories, our body says, thank you for giving me what I needed. I guess I'll take this excess and put it into storage. So it cannot store excess fat in a usable form as a fat molecule. It sends it to the liver, and the liver breaks it down and packages up into a new molecule and sends that out into storage in the body tissues as what we call adipose tissue or body fat. Same thing happens with your excess carbohydrate. The same thing happens with your excess protein. And if the alcohol that you consume provides you calories above and beyond those which your food have provided you, and you don't need those extra calories, then it too will be converted to adipose or lipocytes. So a fat cell is called a lipocyte, and that is how your body stores fat. Again, it's designed to save you and to help you, but the problem is that our world is no longer suited to the function of our body. So when we're talking about fats in foods and we're saying we eat foods and we get fats, we're talking again about all foods. We don't just mean what you think of when you think of fats in a negative way and you think of all these fried foods and all these things that you might label as junk food or treats. We're also thinking of many healthful foods, nuts, seeds, legumes, vegetables, even fruits, fish, eggs, cheese, meat, everything. So let's start by focusing on the food aspect, and then we'll get into the body aspect. From a culinary standpoint, the function of fat is really important, and we have to respect the food science here, right? Because you can't make food that people enjoy if you don't understand the function of fat. Because if you're trying to make healthier foods, you got to know how fat works to know why you need it. And if you know why you need it, and then you know the ways to make sure that you're using healthy fats, then you can create appealing, healthful food. So it adds moisture and richness. If you've ever tried to make a cupcake or something without fat, well, it's going to be very dry and crumbly. Forget the moisture, forget the tenderness. It increases the quality of foods. It makes them more tasty and flavorful. It has a mouth feel to it. So when people put things in their mouth and it has a creamy texture, it has a tongue coating texture, which is the effect of fat, that is something that we are biologically inclined to find appealing. And so when foods have that effect because they are higher in fat, we really like them. And it gives flakiness. Again, food science. If you've ever made croissants from scratch, you roll out a thin layer of a flour-based dough, roll it very thin, you spread a whole lot of butter, a bunch of solid fat, another layer of dough, another layer of butter, you keep alternating, and then when it cooks, it separates into flaky layers. So if you've never made a croissant, you've probably at least seen one or another food like that. Well, that's an important function of fat. It's what makes your pie crust and your biscuits and your croissants so flaky, which is why you really can't make lower fat versions of certain foods because they just won't be that food anymore. So when we're talking about cooking and we're referring to fats as a casual term, really what we mean are solid fats and liquid fats. So when we think of solid fats, look at the picture there with the word fat. If you've ever had something that sat around for a while like meat, you know that this is how the fat looks when it hardens. So that tells you that the fats in our animal foods are solid. Cheese is a solid food. Yes, we may grate it up, and yes, some are softer and some are harder, but they're not liquids, right? So things that are animal-based are generally solid fats. And then we have our liquid fats, like our vegetable oils, whether it's canola or olive or safflower or sunflower. Coconut oil, as you notice in the picture here, and as you may know from real life, is solid, and that's because it's much more like the animal fats, and we will talk about that briefly. But whether it's solid or liquid, it is 100% pure fat. There may be some minerals contained within there, but not enough that anybody's going to go out of their way to try to focus on getting those minerals. The only other valuable contribution is going to be that any of these fats are going to have A, D, E, and K, fat-soluble vitamins within them. So they're all going to have that value, and they're all going to serve the purposes we've described, and they're all going to be something we need some of. We don't have to ever get any fats from plants. We don't have to get any fats from animals. Your body doesn't know the difference into where they came from, the point of origin. Your body just knows that it's getting enough fat and that it's getting the structures that it wants and can use, and not too much of the structures that are harmful in excess. So again, if you eat as an omnivore, you eat plants and animals, there's room for both, but we have to learn how to balance them. If you only eat plant foods like a vegan, then you still could have too much, so you have to learn how much is enough. So as we look at the baked goods in particular, anybody in a culinary program has to appreciate all these details. So you understand, hopefully, the flavor, the richness, the flakiness. But one of the things in food chemistry that is often new knowledge to people is that bread baking is a science. We have to have sugar in bread, as you learned before, or the crust won't form, for example, because that's partially due to the caramelization of the sugar. We also have to have fat to some degree because its goal is actually to interfere with a protein called gluten. Now, I am sure that when you hear the word gluten, many people conjure up all kinds of diet hype thoughts. Most people, I find, have a very poor understanding. So we'll get to protein in the next chapter, but I'll say this once now so that when you hear it again later, it's deeper embedded in your mind. 3 grains in the world, wheat, rye, and barley, are made up of many different chemical components. One of those chemical components is protein. There are many different types of protein components to a grain. Wheat, rye, and barley have a particular one That's called gluten. So gluten is merely a form of protein contained within three particular types of grain that grow in nature. So there is only one instance in the world we know of scientifically where there's a problem with gluten, and that is a condition, a disease called celiac disease. It is actually an autoimmune disease where the body turns against itself, and in that disease, people cannot tolerate gluten. But all the other hype about gluten being fattening or gluten being a problem for so many people is information taken out of context. So we're talking about the important function of gluten in baking foods because gluten is a protein that will expand. And what we want is for fat to interfere with that gluten development because we want things to stay tenderness. We don't want them to be too aerated or they'll be drier. It also increases volume, and again, it's going to make everything much more palatable and appealing. When you deep fry potatoes, the reason that they get so crispy is because they are deep fried in fat. If you've ever tried to make an oven baked French fry to try to be healthy, you know you could not achieve that same texture. Fat creates appealing aromas that add to the pleasure of eating. There are many functions, chemically and psychologically, to the appeal of fat in foods. Additionally, they have nutritional value to a certain point. When you're talking about meat, if you don't have a strong culinary background at this point, let me let you in on a little something. I always like to dispel the myth that healthy eating is expensive. And you see, when you go to the store, you work in a restaurant, and you order or purchase meat, it is rated as prime, choice, or select. The highest grade of meat is prime. Why? Why is that the highest grade? Because it has the most marbling. You see how all that fat is running through that muscle? The more fat, what do you think is going to happen? The more juicy, the more tender, the more flavorful, the more appealing to the palate. People will like it more. They want to like what they go to a restaurant to consume. If you go to the store and you say, I want the best, yummiest meat, then that's what you want, is the fattiest meat. But if you're trying to be more health conscious, then you want the least fatty meat. You want the select version. And guess what? It's the cheapest meat because it is not as desirable from a culinary standpoint. So the cheap meats aren't going to be as juicy and tender unless we cook them in ways that will help them to be so. And that's where the art and science of cooking comes in, such as braising, which means that you put a meat or another food into a heavy lidded pot with moisture and you slow cook it so that the moisture is trapped in the pot and it tenderizes something. So the cheap meat is the healthiest meat, in which case, as you will surely come to know soon if you haven't realized this already, fewer meats equal better health and cheaper meats equal better health. So by eating less meat and buying less expensive meat when you do, you spend less money. Healthy is less expensive. So we have to dig into the science of that. And I'm going to ask that you stop for a moment if you already need to digest everything. And when you're ready, that you make sure you're really focused at this point. Because I could lose you very quickly here. I've got a lot of imagery to help. You may feel you need to go back through this and pause at certain points. Don't let yourself go into this going, oh my gosh, I can't figure this out. Hear me out, and I think by the time we come to the end that you'll be able to connect the dots. So here's what I want you to write down in your notes because this is what you need to know. You need to understand cholesterol and you need to understand triglycerides. And first thing is that you need to understand they are in food and they are in the body. But now let's think logically. Food enters the body. You chew, you swallow, your stomach churns, food gets broken apart. Then the things that food are made of, chemicals called nutrients, get broken apart too. And all the pieces and parts enter into our bloodstream and circulate to our trillions of cells, and then they get rebuilt back into the same structures in forms the body can use. So you're basically like a giant recycling plant if you look at it that way. So, cholesterol. This is a very confusing term for the general public. So, you're about to be extremely and uniquely knowledgeable. Cholesterol is a waxy substance made by the liver of all animals. You're an animal, right? That means the human liver produces the substance called cholesterol, and that means that every other animal out there in its liver produces cholesterol. So you get cholesterol from what you make in your own body, and you get cholesterol from any animal food you eat, eggs, dairy, or meat. You can imagine that if you don't need very much cholesterol, it's easy to end up with too much cholesterol in your body just from food alone. But check this out. Some people genetically have a flaw and their liver overproduces cholesterol. So when they get too much from food, it's a double whammy. So what's the moral of the story? Well, if your body makes too much, then you really have to worry about what you get from food. And even if your body doesn't make too much, you can easily get too much from food, so you need to think about that. And so really what that means is that, hey, once again, fewer animal foods in our diet equals fewer issues related to excess of certain substances. You have a place for everything, but everything in moderation. Now, in the past few years, scientists have made some new progress in the domain of cholesterol. And there was a little period of time not long ago where it was circulating in the media that, oh, cholesterol doesn't matter anymore. But that was a snippet. That wasn't the big picture. So what we can say at this point is that different people can tolerate different amounts of cholesterol, but we're not sure how to figure out for an individual what his or her body can tolerate. So we for a long time thought there was a similar limit for everyone. And so we set an amount or a recommendation based on that. Now we think that somewhere in the future we'll be able to give people their own unique limits, much like we can do for carbohydrate and fat and protein overall. We'll be able to break fats down and say you need this much of that kind. We can't do that yet though. So until we know more, erring on the side of caution is best, because we know that for some people, too much is a bigger concern. So one of the things that you want to know, though, is why cholesterol is a positive thing. Again, I mentioned a little while ago that every one of your trillions of cells has a membrane made out of fat. Specifically, it's this waxy, fat-like substance called cholesterol, and that's why your body makes it for you, to make sure that you get enough in order to make your new cells. So you can never eat any animal foods, and there are cultures all over the world who consume no animal foods, and they're perfectly fine. And this is a good example of why. You could never eat an animal food, and you would be able to produce all the new cells you need just with the cholesterol that your liver makes alone. So we don't actually need cholesterol from food. We need other fats that are in food, but not cholesterol. So technically, every single bit of cholesterol we get from our food is in excess of our needs. It's pretty profound when you think about it. So you can see here, without us digging deep, that cholesterol has a lot of important functions in your bodies. Hopefully, just as you read this bullet list, your mind's going, wow, cholesterol is something important. You need enough, but not too much. Your body can easily make enough. And oh my goodness, some people's bodies even make too much. Well, what do we do with those people that make too much, you ask? Well, those are the people for whom cholesterol-lowering medications are designed. Those medicines weren't designed so that everybody could get away with eating whatever they want. Those were designed for people who had a problem beyond their control. So we're not going to dig any deeper into that at this level, but there's just a little insight for you in terms of the real world. The other one I told you need to know is a triglyceride. Now, if you've ever taken chemistry, you may find this less intimidating. If not, right now your eyes are crossed and your mind's feeling boggled. But don't let yourself go there. Keep your focus, and we're going to try to make this simple. So again, the chemical structure that we call, in general terms, fat is in all forms of life, plants and animals. So cholesterol was a waxy substance that gets generally referred to as a fat, although officially it's a waxy substance that is produced in the liver of animals. Triglycerides are chemical structures that we call fat that are in everything. Got it? That's not too bad, right? If you know what tri means, the prefix, you know it means 3. So this particular chemical molecule is a structure made out of 3 chains. These chains are actually called fatty acids. Your book does mention this. So you see here 3 fatty acid chains, and you can see that they are all connected to what is called a glycerol backbone. I don't expect you to be able to draw this or understand the SN numbers. Let's keep it simple. Tri is 3 chains attached to what? Glycerol. Triglyceride. Now you know why it's called a triglyceride. So when we eat food that contains fat, well, yeah, some of it is actually that waxy substance, cholesterol. The rest is this, triglycerides. Some of them have long chains, some of them have medium chains, some of them have short chains like the bottom one. It is beyond the scope of this course for us to dig into how different chain links function. But I'll say this for you. Longer chains are more harmful, shorter chains are less harmful. So in the past few years, there's been a bunch of stuff in magazines and television shows and the internet about, oh, we thought certain fats were bad, but they're not. Again, that's not an accurate statement. Certain foods have triglycerides with longer chains and others with shorter chains, and some have a variety like you see in this picture. Certain foods, therefore, are more or less harmful, but it doesn't mean things are black and white. You got to be careful with listening to all the hype you hear, because you're having a hard time probably sitting through 2 hours of lecture. It really takes several years of education to understand these things. So you can't hear a little snippet of something somewhere and it's truly meaningful because there's no way it was well explained, as brief as that information was, right? So you really need to be skeptical as a consumer and realize that nothing has really changed that much in the science. It's just that everybody is always looking to put a new and creative spin on something, because that's how you keep the news media cranking out sensationalism, and you keep people watching shows and buying magazines and purchasing diet plans and so on. Stick with the basics and your life will be so much simpler. So all fats are either cholesterol or triglycerides in food, and the structure of the triglyceride determines its function. Some function in more beneficial ways, and some, when we get more than we need, function in harmful ways. That's what you want to know. So, what are those fatty acid chains? Why does your book even tell you about it? They are in chemistry just chains of carbon. The word organic is not something that's new. It wasn't meant to refer to farming. That's a trendy term. The word organic in chemistry simply means carbon-based, and most life forms are carbon-based. So carbon chains are what bind to that glycerol backbone rather. And it is what happens within those carbon chains that determines how that triglyceride functions. So look here, these visuals should help. The top one, you see that every single carbon has an H, a hydrogen bound to it. Chemistry. In other words, that chain of carbon molecules is fully saturated with hydrogen. If you took a sponge and you dunked it in a bucket and you pulled it out, it would be fully saturated, right? Well, that's what happened. The carbon chain is fully saturated with hydrogen. Now, the one below it is unsaturated. It's either fully saturated or it's not. So if it's not, we just call it unsaturated. You can see some H's are missing. Well, how does that make it different? Well, you notice the top one is one straight line. It's very rigid. Think of cheddar cheese. Very solid. A lot of saturated fatty acid chains in there because it makes something firmer and solid. The bottom one is droopy, bendy, flexible. So that means whatever food it's in will be softer, more pliable. Maybe that's your cottage cheese. Butter sticks or butter blocks are solid, so they're going to have more saturated fatty acids. Oils are liquid. They're bendy, flowy, flexible, so they're going to have more unsaturated fatty acids. See the logic? So we can either have a saturated fatty acid chain as part of our triglyceride, or we can have unsaturated fatty acid chains. Mono, which I hope you know, means one. Di would mean two. Tri would mean three. And poly means many, more than one. So some of our unsaturated fatty acid chains are just have one point where they're not fully saturated. So we call that a mono unsaturated. And some have multiple or many points where they're not saturated, so we call those logically poly unsaturated. But who wants to write out mono unsaturated fatty acid, poly unsaturated fatty acid, and who even wants to say it? So we abbreviate MUFA, PUFA, and we just say muffas and puffas. So you're starting to get the impression that saturated things like the butter and the cheddar cheese I mentioned are less healthful, and unsaturated things like the softer cheeses and the liquid oils are more healthful. So saturated fats are the less healthful, and we have a need for some, but we have a limit to how much we can tolerate, whereas muffas and puffas are the really beneficial fats, and we want to get them plentifully. Plentifully? How do you say that? Whatever it is. So now it's starting to make a little more sense, I hope. We look here, saturated fats are those which are usually solid at room temperature. Yes, I suppose that you could turn the air conditioning off, and if it got to be 90 degrees, 100 degrees in the room, the butter might start to melt. Chances are it still would remain partially solid. So we all know that if you sit a stick of butter or margarine or something out on a counter, it may soften up, but it's usually going to still retain its structure, right? Solid. We know that coconut oil stays solid. We know that these fats in our meats congeal and they are solid. So all of these are saturated fats, rigid structures, as opposed to the unsaturated fats. So all of your vegetable oils, olive, canola, sunflower, etc., are liquid, right? And then these are the types of fats that are primarily contained within plants. So animal foods are mostly saturated fat, though that doesn't mean they don't have any unsaturated fat. And plant foods are mostly unsaturated fat, though that doesn't mean they have no saturated fat. Make sense? Take a break, pause, whatever you need to do. So one more thing you need to know, but this is really cool stuff because I'm going to have some current updates for you shortly. You are at a prime time for some change taking place in the world of food and nutrition. It's an awesome time to be living. So before we get to the good news, let's look at the bad news. So now you understand that an unsaturated fatty acid chain is one missing some hydrogens. It is not fully saturated with hydrogen. But if scientists take those unsaturated fatty acid chains into their laboratory and they add hydrogen into those points that are not hydrogenated, not full of hydrogen, then they are making an unsaturated fatty acid into a saturated fatty acid. Well, why would they want to do that? Well, if you take vegetable oil and you turn it into something solid by adding hydrogen, by hydrogenating it, then you are able to end up with margarine or shortening, spreadable substances that maintain themselves at room temperature. So shortening and margarines are simply hydrogenated oils, right? So you took a liquid fat and you turned it into a solid fat. You transformed an unsaturated fat into a less healthful saturated fat. And so we call those structures trans fats. They are not good news. Now, I will say this. What we know scientifically is that all animals contain a little bit of a structure that looks exactly like the one we create in the laboratory. So, technically, all animals contain some trans fat. But what we seem to have figured out so far is that when it has been created by nature, hence it's in the animals, we can handle it better. It's when we create it in a laboratory that it doesn't function in a nice way inside our internal environment. So that's why the government has banned man-made trans fats. Yep, it's taken years. But as of 2018, they finally got the law passed. Not even been a year at the point of this recording. And they passed the law to say, we need you to all stop creating trans fats in your laboratories because those trans fats are so toxic to the human body and are contributing to the leading causes of death in this country. So I can't say that there are none out there because they always give companies a couple of years to gradually make a shift and they don't crack down too hard for the first couple of years. And companies have to figure out what they're going to do instead because there was a reason they were doing this. It made products more shelf stable. It was cheaper than using some of the alternatives. So we're starting to see them disappear from our food supply, and that is the really good news. So again, visually, when we talk about converting unsaturated fatty acids into saturated fatty acids, we are referring to the transforming of one type of molecule to another through the addition of hydrogen. So it is called hydrogenation. So again, let's sum it all up. Cholesterol is a unique substance. We usually just refer to it as a fat because it keeps things simple and because it functions in the way that other fats function in our body. Triglycerides are officially fat molecules. So if I say the fat in that food, I usually mean the triglycerides in that food. They can be saturated or unsaturated based on the structure of their fatty acid chains. When we talk about the inside of the body, we talk about the cholesterol in the body because it's being made in the liver, and we talk about the triglycerides in the body, which are the fat molecules in our blood and in our storage form. So when you say body fat, what you mean are big masses of triglycerides. And because fat is a living tissue, it is constantly circulating some of its components in our blood because they do some productive things. So you have triglycerides in your blood and triglycerides in your fat tissue. So when you look at this picture, can you reason it out? We know that triglycerides are either saturated or unsaturated. 3 fatty acid chains that are either saturated or unsaturated attached to a glycerol backbone. We know that trans fats are unsaturated fatty acids that have been converted into saturated fatty acids. And we know that of those which are unsaturated, some have 1 point of unsaturated, MUFAs, and some have multiple points of unsaturated, PUFAs. We know that saturated and trans are harmful, especially above and beyond a certain point, and we know that unsaturated are largely beneficial. But again, too much of a good thing can certainly be a bad thing. And finally, on a brief note, when you hear about omega-3s, and you probably don't hear as much about omega-6s, you're hearing about a particular type of PUFA that is beneficial in very specific ways. And those details don't matter here. The point is that when people talk about foods being rich in omega-3s like walnuts and almonds and salmon, it's because this is a really good thing. So all unsaturated fats are positive. Some just have unique benefits from others. If you can get to this point and make sense of it, you're doing really well. So remember, you learned early on, I had the lecture for you on how to read a food label. I had the handout. Hopefully you had the handout in front of you as you listened to the lecture, and I walked you line by line, and I told you, cross this out, cross that out. And one of the first things I said was the total fat represents all kinds of fat in the food, good and bad, and we don't care about the total. What we care about are the kinds, so you can ignore the total fat line, cross it out. For me, as a registered dietitian, if I am digging deep into someone's eating habits, I might be interested in their total fat. But for the average person, it's not very meaningful because the average person needs to be focused on what types of fat they're getting because that's how that person can best manage his or her health. So the trans fats and the saturated fats, are the least desirable. So let me break it down simply. We want no trans fats. We need and can tolerate some saturated fats, but too much is a bad thing. It's harmful. So there is a tolerable upper limit. Amongst the dietary recommendations, remember, if something is harmful in excess, it has a TUL. Unsaturated fats are those which we know to be primarily beneficial in the body, and therefore we don't really need to be worried about getting too much because probably it's unlikely to happen, and we want to make sure we're getting plenty of them. How do they differ? Well, they differ in being better or worse for you based on what's happening inside your body once they get there. So let's start at point A one more time so you're sure you're on track. You put food in your mouth and you chew it up. That starts to break the food apart. The saliva has chemicals in it which start to help break down not just the food itself into pieces, but the nutrients, the chemicals that make up the food start to get broken down as well. It goes down the esophagus and it all enters the stomach. chemicals from your stomach are secreted and help to break down the food and the individual nutrients. The muscular contraction of your stomach breaks down the food and the chemical nutrients, and all of it mixes with that stomach acid and it dumps into your intestines. There, more chemicals break it down, more muscular contractions break it down, and then if you reflect back on what you learned earlier, it all gets absorbed through the walls of the intestines and it's absorbed into your circulating body fluids so it can be delivered to all of your trillions of cells where the nutrients are used. How are they used? Well, they're reassembled into new structures that are recognizable within the body and that can be used throughout the body. So take a moment, read the words, and let it sink in. Okay. So once you have absorbed the glycerol backbones and the fatty acid chains that were broken apart during digestion, they end up getting carried from your bloodstream at the point of absorption to the liver, because your liver is kind of like the central processing facility in your body for all the fats. It says, thanks for all these pieces and parts. Let me look and see what is needed throughout the body, and I'm going to put these into new packages and distribute or deliver them out to the body as needed. So remember that cholesterol is already being produced in the liver. In fact, all the cholesterol that you need. So when you have received some from your food, the body says, I can tolerate a certain amount of this. That's fine. But once you cross a certain threshold, it's too much. And I have to package it up into some sort of package and send it out through the body. And if it's too much, then I might have to package it into my quote unquote extra I don't know what to do with packages. So that's not going to be good news, right? So too much of something can be problematic, including cholesterol. The triglycerides that were in your food and broken down into the glycerol backbones and fatty acids are going to get packaged back into new triglycerides. Some are going to be sent to your adipose tissue, make some more body fat for all those wonderful things it does, like cushion and temperature regulation. Some of them are going to be sent out into your blood to circulate to different points for different purposes. Ultimately, while some of those triglyceride structures will leave your liver and enter your bloodstream just as you picture them, others are going to get packaged up with the cholesterol. Your body says, some triglycerides can travel through the blood by themselves. But most of them, well, they don't travel very well alone. They need somebody to tote them around. So I'm going to take a lot of your triglycerides and I'm going to package them with the cholesterol. And I'm going to take that little package and I'm going to attach it to some sort of a transport vehicle, a taxi service, if you will, and have that protein transport those lipids, those fats, throughout your body. Let's look a little deeper, and I think this will begin to make more sense. So the word lipids. Now we're shifting from food to the body. So when we're talking about food, we're talking about the fats that are in our food. But medically speaking, once they're inside your body and your liver is putting them all back together and turning them into things that do stuff inside the body, then they travel around in your blood and they're called lipids or blood lipids. So you go to the doctor, hopefully once a year, for an annual checkup, and one of the things they do is take your blood. Then they tell you about your blood results. Why do they do this? Well, because when we look at what's in your blood, we know what's happening inside your body. We can forecast certain diseases that are coming up, because if your levels of certain things in your blood are excessive, then something's not functioning right. Either you're taking in too much of certain things or the function of your body is impaired such that it can't use or excrete things the right way. So then that leads us down a path. What's the problem here? Too much coming in, the body not using things right, or the body not being able to excrete things? That's how we diagnose people with certain conditions. So, in the terms of the fats in your body, the lipids, we look at what's called a lipid panel. And if you've ever had blood results, this might look vaguely familiar. The average person isn't going to really understand this, but I'm going to help you to be a more informed average person. And then you're going to have a better appreciation of why what you eat matters in terms of your health. So let's look a little more in depth. First of all, I have to share with you what I know you will find confusing. It's just downright annoying. When we look at the blood results, the lipid panel, after our blood's been measured and assessed, the term total cholesterol. So you look right below lipid panel, it says cholesterol, total. It doesn't just mean that waxy substance that's produced in the liver of animals. Really something we need to change because it's confusing a lot of people. It is being used as a different term. In this context, it means total of all the fats in your blood. So the total cholesterol are all of the triglycerides and all of the cholesterol molecules combined. The problem is that doesn't tell us what kind of stuff you have. It doesn't tell us how much of it's cholesterol or how much of it's triglycerides, and it doesn't tell us if the triglycerides in your blood are saturated or unsaturated, right? And you know that it all comes down to those details. So we are now in healthcare saying your total cholesterol really doesn't matter very much. What matters are the types. And so we say that there's good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. And we use the terms HDL and LDL. What we really mean, though, is there's a whole collection of fats in your blood that are good, that are useful, that aren't very harmful. And there's a whole collection of fats in your blood that are potentially harmful to you. And if you have too many of them, we need you to fix that. So a lot of fancy terminology breaks down to some really simple concepts, and that's what I want you to be able to walk away with. So again, there's those fancy, complicated blood results. And the total cholesterol is kind of like the umbrella. And imagine that the umbrella has 3 handles. So some portion of it is the LDL, some portion of it is the HDL, and some portion of it is the triglycerides. So if you look up there, you see that this person has triglycerides, and it gives you a number 85. You see HDL cholesterol, and it gives you a 42. And a little further down, you see LDL cholesterol, and it gives you 211. Now, to make things even more complicated, 211 plus 85 plus 42 doesn't equal 270, but again, that's beyond the scope of this course. Simply, the total cholesterol equals the combination of those 3 things. And what matters is how much you have of those 3 things separately. So if you look at this report, you notice that the LDL says 211 and it says high. And over to the far right, it shows you what would be ideal, 0 to 99. So not over 99 for this guy, and he's got 211. So you know that's not good. The LDL is the lousy stuff, the little devils, the troublemakers. The HDL are the little angels, the good guys. And the HDL help get rid of the LDL. So you want a lot of the HDL. Well, this person you can see has 42. And to the far right, it says the goal for this person is greater than 39. So this person's passing, but that's kind of like saying I have a D in my class, right? When you want an A. So the higher that number goes, 60, 70, 80, the better off the person will be. And if you look at the triglycerides, it says this person has 85. And it tells you that 0 to 149 is acceptable. So on that point, the person would be okay. The actual plain by themselves triglycerides floating in their blood are well controlled, but the packages of cholesterol and triglycerides are not well balanced. Now, again, in the next chapter, you're going to learn about protein. And you're going to learn that proteins are these molecules which have many important functions in the body, well beyond what you probably could imagine at this point. One of their functions is to act as a transport vehicle. I said these lipids, they get packaged into packages. The cholesterol, the triglycerides get put together because they can't all function and float around by themselves, and they have to travel through the blood, hitching this ride. So when a lipid is attached to a protein so that the protein can transport the lipid through the blood, then a lipid and a protein become known together as a lipoprotein. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? So again, simply put, lipoproteins are protein molecules serving as transport vehicles for lipids. Did you ever see the Jetsons, or am I just too old? The Jetsons were a cartoon that was supposed to be what life would be like at about this point in time. And so they flew around their little spaceships. Those were their transport vehicles. It sounds very futuristic, right? And so the passengers are the lipids, and the transport vehicle are the protein. So if you look at it this way, then you see the protein is transporting or carrying the lipids. What lipids? Once again, a mixture of cholesterol and triglycerides. So what does the word dense mean? Well, hopefully in your general vocabulary, you know it means a high concentration of something. If something is nutrient dense, you know it has a lot of nutrients in a small amount. In other words, we say it has a lot of bang for your bite. You know that if a room is densely packed, there are a lot of people crammed into that space. So now just use your common sense. If there is a very low density of protein, then that means there's a whole lot of lipid. And so when we have too much cholesterol in our body, whether the liver produced too much and or we consume too much, and when we have taken in more saturated fat than our body can handle, in other words, more than the tolerable upper limit, the body says all this excess stuff is going to get packaged together, and then I'm going to shove it onto a little protein taxi and send it out, and I don't really know what's going to happen because I don't really need it. It's excess. So it's just going to be traveling around in your blood, kind of hanging out, loitering. And hey, when there's people who don't know anywhere to go and they're hanging out and loitering, don't we know that often means trouble? Well, in this case, that's the same situation. It's going to travel through your blood vessels, and more than likely it's going to settle down and permanently fix itself to the walls. And that's how we form what are called plaques, which basically clog up our blood vessels, stopping the blood flow and causing all sorts of problems. High density, though, means you have a lot of protein, in which case it's the reverse. There's just a little bit of lipids. Well, your body doesn't need much fat for productive purposes. It needs some, but not a lot. So it says, thank you for the cholesterol I need. Thank you for a little bit of saturated fat that I need. And thank you for all those wonderful muffas and puffas. I don't need much of anything, so I've got what I need right here in this little bitty package. And I'm going to send that out and say, do what you do. Do some good stuff. And hey, if you run out of things to do, come back to the liver so you're not out there causing any problems. And on your way back, try to grab some of that bad stuff, that LDL, those lousy troublemakers, and bring them back with you. So not only does the good stuff, the HDL, serve productive purposes in its own right, and not only does it come back so it's not out there causing trouble, but it also tries to drag some of the lousy stuff back with it. So it serves the reason that you want a lot of HDL in your body and not a lot of LDL. these are just some visuals to help illustrate what we're talking about. You can see the LDL, the lousy, or the low density. You can see the HDL, the healthy, or the high density. And so when the liver processes all of this, the LDL goes out to the cells of the body and pretty much stays out there circulating around the blood, whereas the HDL does what it needs to do, and if it doesn't all get used, it comes back and it says, recycle me, use me productively. So your lipoproteins, your low density lipoproteins and your high density lipoproteins, LDL and HDL, are the packages formed in your liver from all of the cholesterol and fats and bound to a protein to travel through your body. Hopefully you're kind of astounded with yourself and your ability to understand at this point. If you need to, this is a good point to pause, take a break, and come back. So here we go in summary, some great visuals. I love the picture at the bottom. You see the little HDLs hard working, toting away all the bad stuff. Let me clean this place up. Let me clear this artery out so the blood flow through nicely. Here you got the LDL dumping all their garbage going, hey, let me clog up this passageway. So you can easily differentiate, right? H is healthy, L is lousy. Easiest way to remember it. Inside that blood vessel, when there's too much saturated fat from our diet, and when we eat trans fats, and when there's too much cholesterol, whether it's made by our liver or coming from our food, then it's all packaged into these LDLs, and they go out and they linger around and they adhere to the side of our blood vessel. They don't just stick. They dig deep and they embed themselves, which is why they become these permanent fixtures called plaques. And let me tell you right now, people don't get this. There's no medicine that removes plaques. There's no surgery that removes plaques. There is no means by which we can roto-rooter your blood vessels out and get rid of plaques. We can put a stent in, which is like putting a slinky in and smushing the plaque back against the sides, but it's going to grow back. We can give you drugs to try to widen the blood vessels so that there's not such a narrow passageway between the plaques. But everything we do, surgery or drugs, has side effects. So the best approach is to avoid forming plaques in the first place, and that's why lifestyle and diet in particular matters so much. So one more visual for you. The lousy cholesterol, the LDL, leaves the liver and it travels out into our bloodstream, circulating from head to toe, every inch of our body. Most of it doesn't have a productive purpose, so it tends to settle down and embed itself in the walls of the vessels, forming plaques, clogging up the blood vessels. The LDL not only heads back to the liver, but tries to drag some of the lousy stuff with it. If you can understand this, you're really in a good place right now. So, what's the leading cause of premature, meaning too early, and preventable, meaning it didn't have to happen, death and disability? So you can be alive, but disabled and miserable from your health problems. The leading cause, cardiovascular disease. Disease of the heart and blood vessels throughout the entire body. This isn't the first time you've heard this. It was in chapter 1 and it was in those lectures. Clearly, you can now connect the dots as to why high LDL, lousy stuff, and low HDL, healthy stuff, are major factors. When those plaques form, that state of plaque formation is clinically known as atherosclerosis. So genesis means the formation of something. If you're a fan of the Bible, you know that word Genesis. If not, Genesis means the formation of something. So atherogenesis is the formation of plaques, and the presence of plaques is called atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries due to plaques. And atherogenic, a plaque forming diet, is one that is high in saturated and or trans fats and low in muffas and puffas. Take a moment, take it in. So, simplifying it, muffas and puffas, polyunsaturates and monounsaturates are the good fats, saturated fats and trans fats are the bad fats. Let me restate this. We need some saturated fat, but only a very limited amount. Therefore, too much is problematic. Hence, there is a tolerable upper limit, and when we exceed it, our health risks are known to increase. So, let's look back. Let's connect those dots. We pick up something in the store. We look at the label. We go, I can ignore the total fats, but I know that I want a low intake of saturated fat, and how much is low? 5% or less. So when I see 15%, I go, wait a minute, 5% is low, 10% is moderate, which is getting up there, 15% is significant. One serving, just a cup of this, has 15% of what I should have in the whole day. 15% out of 100%. How much is 100%? Well, I can look down at the bottom and I can see sat fat less than 20 grams. So 100% of my saturated fat for the day would be about 20 grams. So one serving of this contains 15% of those 20 grams. What if I have 2 cups of this? Now I'm up to 30% from one choice in my entire day. So if my choices are low, 5% or less, I can eat a lot more food and be less hungry, and I'm probably choosing healthier foods. So all of that, hopefully, is common sense at this point, because again, I taught this to you when we covered chapter 2. You have 2 handouts, the 2-step process, and how to read a food label image. Another little close-up. Again, here's why we care about too much of these saturated fats. Some people's genes may be hardier than others, and 20 is an average. Nothing's an exact science. Again, we're all unique individuals. Maybe, and I'm just making this up, maybe you can handle 40 grams a day, and I can only handle 12. Nobody knows exactly. So we have averaged everything, and if we all use that as a guideline and stick pretty close to it, the chances are good that we'll be okay. So when we think of saturated fats, I usually like to simplify it. I say sweets, treats, and greasy meats, the eats. Obviously, there are other things. Again, now you understand coconut oil. And right now, there's somebody going, what? No, coconut oil's okay. I heard it from this diet or that website or that show. All you have to do if you want to know more about the accurate science is post it in the discussion board or send me an email, and I will send you some credible, relevant, and timely information, some science-based evidence, not anything from a .com website, but something from a .edu website or a professional scientific source. So yes, if you like coconut oil, of your 20 grams of saturated fat per day, you can use coconut oil. But we can't just eat unlimited amounts of saturated fat no matter where they come from, because the body just knows when it gets too much, and now you know what it does with it. We know trans fat is bad. Hopefully that's clear. No trans fat. So when you look at the bottom, there is no line down there in that little cheat sheet section. There is no mention. So somebody goes, well, how do I know how much trans fat I should have? Well, none, right? We don't want any. We know that technically there's a little bit in all animal foods, but we think we don't have to worry about that as much. So that means we don't want any foods that might contain any of this man-made trans fat. So there's no percentage because there's no recommendation. So you can't give a percent of nothing. So the fact that it shows us that there is actually some in here, when we want none, there's 2.5 grams. Yikes. I'm not putting that in my body. That is not a healthy choice. These are where you're going to find most of it. And yes, like I said before, it is still out there in all your snack foods. It's the oils being used to deep fry foods, the oils being used to make all of your pastries and stuff shelf-stable. So you know it's in animal foods and you know it's in sweets and treats. So here we go. Stick close to nature's creation, guys. Whole foods. Doesn't mean that nothing can be processed, but remember, highly processed is a problem. And the things in these boxes are highly processed. So cholesterol is the next line, and you understand we make all we need. We can handle a little extra coming from our food, but we got to limit it, so we want a low intake of cholesterol. Hence, there's a tolerable upper limit, and at the very bottom it says less than 300 milligrams a day. Again, we are currently debating if that number should change, but it doesn't matter. So what if it's 400 or 500? It's still not much. So low, 5% or less, is best. So when you see 40%, almost half a day's worth in one thing, yikes, it better be a special occasion and a rare treat. Animal foods, remember. All livers of all animals, ours and every other animal, make cholesterol, so all animals, us included, contain cholesterol. Easy to get too much. One more time. Disease of the heart and the blood vessel. Cardio means heart, vascular means vessels. You are looking at your cardiovascular system in this picture. It is every inch of your being. Every one of those vessels is connected back to your heart. So it is one gigantic system. Whatever is happening in one part of it is happening in the other. When your blood pressure is high, it means the pressure in every one of those vessels in that picture is elevated. So the blood is pressing against the walls of those vessels, damaging them. When somebody has a blood clot in their leg, it is probably because a plaque burst and the contents spilled out and plugged up something somewhere. That's the main cause of strokes and heart attacks, is these plaques bursting, and they don't have to be large. Large means they're probably just going to block off the whole passageway as a fixed plaque. Smaller means they're going to burst. We all have plaques. They are all bursting at different times. But the idea is that if we minimize it, the chance of problems is less. So you start forming plaques in your early childhood. And if your early childhood is an active one with a fairly healthy diet, it's going to take you a long time for them to build up. If you start out life eating pretty poorly and not moving much, and then you stick with that plan, then you're going to have problems earlier in life. So when I have patients having strokes and heart attacks in their 20s now, it's not a surprise to me. What used to happen in 50s and 60s now happens in our 20s and our 30s and our 40s because our lifestyles have changed. We don't eat well and we don't move enough. So how come when you look at this label, there's no lines for the muffas and puffas, the good guys? Well, because we don't need to tell you how much to get. First of all, you're probably not going to suffer harm from too much. We don't even know how much it would take to be harmful. Most people struggle to get enough. Too much hasn't become a problem. So our food labeling is focused on excesses. And so we know which things tend to be most excessive, and we've honed in on those things at the point of purchase by using the nutrition facts panel. So you don't have to worry how much of it's muffas and puffas. If it's not full of saturated and trans, it's got muffas and puffas, and that means you're doing good. You're on the right track. So healthy fats, muffas, and puffas are everywhere. They're in all plant foods, and they're in other foods too, like much of your seafood, which is why you always hear salmons are rich in the puffas, which are omega-3s. Here's something, though, that is a useful tidbit to you. Botany is the science of plant life. So the botanical term fruit actually means the seed-bearing structure in a flowering plant. So lots of things are technically fruits in terms of botany, things like corn, tomatoes, avocados, wheat. So all plants really do have fat because even fruits have fat. Some things, though, are not what you think of when you think of a fruit. We usually mean berries or peaches or apples or pears or oranges. Those are the traditional fruits in most of our minds. And though they may have almost no fat, technically they all have some amount. But it's so minuscule in some that it's not even worth counting. So we usually just say fruits don't have fat because most of us, when we use the word fruit, don't mean corn, tomatoes, wheat, and avocados. We mean traditional fruits. But it's worth knowing that technically there's some in everything. If I ask you a question, what food doesn't have fat, you would want to say fruit. So when you think lots of good high density lipoprotein, the healthy stuff, here's what you should think of. Yes, exercise. When we are more active, it prompts our liver to package more stuff into the HDL. That's way too complicated to explain here, but suffice it to say that there are many reasons that we hear that being physically active is important for health, and this is just one of a long list. MUFAs, PUFAs, and activity equal lots of the healthy stuff in your body, which cancels out some of the lousy stuff and promotes the optimal functioning of your organ systems. So how can you prepare palatable and appealing dishes from a culinary standpoint, and baked goods with, that should say baked goods, sorry about that, with less fat or healthier fats? Pages 83 and 84, those sections there, talk about all sorts of things. So this is not a long chapter in your book. Hopefully it shouldn't take you more than an hour tops to read it. So that and the lecture combined are a reasonable investment of time this week. Be sure you focus in on those and that you are prepared for the discussion board. If you have any questions, of course, I am always here. Discussion board or email, whatever you are most comfortable with.